to get us started because I think we have a lot of interested people in this room, perhaps with a lot of questions, and as much as possible, we'd like to save time for you to be able to engage in this discussion along with the panelists that we have with us here today. So I'd like to begin by introducing myself. My name is Mona Siegel, and I am a professor here in the history department at Sac State. This is the third of a series of conversations that we've had over the course of this semester on the broad topic, historical perspectives on America in crisis. And we've looked at a number of different topics, the question of fascism and authoritarianism in America, the questions surrounding immigration and Muslim-American relations, and then finally today we're turning our attention to women's activism and reproductive rights in historical context. I have to say that I have a personal attachment to the topic of this particular discussion here today, in part as an academic. When I'm not busy in the classroom here, I'm engaged in researching a book on early feminism around the world, in Europe, in the United States, in China, and in Egypt. And I have to confess to have often thought in the past months about these women whom I study, who lived a century ago, and wonder what they would make of the political climate and of the issues surrounding women's rights and reproductive rights today. And so academically, I'm interested in this conversation we're having, but I am also going to confess in front of one and all of you that I have I feel like a personal vested interest in this conversation as well. And I have a visual display to explain why. Prior to the last presidential election, I had never bought a political button before, a campaign button. And I ordered one, this past one, and so I'm going to show you all what it looked like. So if you can't see it at the back, it says Madam President, and it was a Hillary Clinton campaign button. It's embarrassingly large, and when I ordered it, I did not know that it would be so big. But I ordered it in part out of support for a candidate who I questioned at the beginning, but came to really respect over the course of the campaign. But I also ordered it because I felt like I was being part of a moment in history. And as a woman and as a feminist, it was exciting to me to see a woman at the threshold of perhaps the highest political office in the land here in the United States. So, of course, that didn't happen in the end. I'll keep my button anyway, but that future did not come to be a reality. Women did not break the glass ceiling in terms of presidential politics in this election, but that does not mean that gender, ideas about women, ideas about men, about masculinity, about femininity, didn't play an extremely important role in that election of 2016, or continue to do so in American politics today. And if you didn't read it in the newspaper at the time, I'll just share with you now that the election of 2016 that we just completed brought the largest gender gap between male and female voters of any election since those statistics have been kept, since World War II, essentially. So on the whole, on the aggregate in America, male and female voters were farther apart in their choices in this election than any time in recent American history, and I think that begs some reflection and raises perhaps some interesting question. Gender has not disappeared from the newspapers, from the rhetoric, the appointments, the policies of the Trump administration since they have taken office. And so understanding all of that is tough, and that's in part why we have brought together the panel of specialists that we have here today, not so much to know where we're going from here, but at least to help us understand how we got here, or to bring us closer to understanding that. So in just a second here, I'm going to introduce my co-panelists, or the panelists here with us today. And I brought a series of questions with me that I'd like to pose to them to get this conversation started. We'll take half an hour or so to work our way through those questions, and at that point in time, we'll open up the floor to questions from the audience. Okay, great. Thank you all. So I'm going to introduce the panelists in alphabetical order. So I'm going to begin with my colleague directly next to me, This is Dr. Paula Austin, who is an assistant professor of history and teaches both African American history and civil rights history classes. I know some of her students are in the audience with us here today. She is working on a book manuscript that examines the intellectual lives of poor and working class African American women and young people in the racially segregated American capital, Washington, D.C. in the early 20th century. She is also working on an article tracing the development of policing and anti-police brutality campaigns in Washington, D.C. from the race riots of 1919 up through World War II. So if you could maybe put your hands together and welcome Dr. Paula Austin. We'll get the clapping out of the way here. So, actually seated directly next to her is Dr. Rebecca Kluchin. Dr. Kluchin is a professor of history here at Sacramento State who studies the history of women and of medicine. Her book, Fit to be Tied, Sterilization and Reproductive Rights in America from 1950 to 1980, won the Frances Keller Sierra Prize for the best monograph from the Western Association of Women's Historians. And I have to say, I've read the book and it deserved the prize. So. Dr. Kluchin is working now on a book about the maternal-fetal relationship in America and the efforts to establish fetal personhood. As part of this research, she was the Foundation for the History of Women in Medicine Fellow at the Countway Library at Harvard Medical School in 2014 and 2015. Let's welcome Dr. Kluchin. And then at the end of the table, last but not least, is Dr. Beth Slutsky. Dr. Slutsky is a historian of modern American women's history and a scholar of history education with the California History Social Science Project. She published the book Gendering Radicalism, Women and Communism in 20th Century California in 2015. And her book explores the roots of leftist radicalism among California women. Dr. Slutsky is the lead author of California's newly revised and adopted History Social Science Framework. So all of you future history teachers in the room, you might want to corner her after our discussion today. That's the framework that guides K-12 history education in California. She teaches courses in women's history, social and cultural history, and history education. So let's welcome Dr. Slutsky. So I'm actually going to start with a question for Dr. Slutsky and go back to the campaign and to my obnoxiously large campaign button here. And talk about the fact that the Democratic Party nominated a woman, nominated Hillary Clinton, making her the first female candidate for president from a major political party, excuse me. And so I'd like you to help us maybe get a little historical context to understand this history of women's participation in politics, the ability to vote, to actually run for office, and maybe to let us know if any other women have tried to run for office before Hillary Clinton.
Sure. Okay. Is this necessary? You guys in the back, you need it. Okay, good. So I'm going to try to give us a little bit of historical context without getting into too much detail, but my goal is to provide you with an explanation why it was such a big deal that Hillary Clinton was the first presidential candidate to be nominated by one of the two political parties. And so, I have a couple of people and a couple of eras that I want to point to give you some context to understand why it was such a big deal. Women have, of course, been deeply involved in politics since the founding of the nation, or since before the founding of the nation, though they were only able to participate as voters directly with the 19th Amendment in 1920 at the national level. Though before 1920, some women in some states could, of course, vote. In California, women get the right to vote earlier than in a lot of other states. In 1911, women in California get the right to vote, and they start running for office in local and state elections. The first woman to run for and win a congressional election happened in 1916. A woman named Jeanette Rankin was the first woman from the state of Montana. She won as a congresswoman and a suffragist and a progressive. So she's the first woman to get involved in politics at the national level. Though before her, women, again, I want to underscore, before they had the right to vote, they were involved in politics. Black women and brown women and white women. Women, right after the Civil War, when slaves are freed in the 1860s, Black women exercised their political voice by accompanying their husbands who had just gotten the right to vote, and their sons and their brothers and their fathers. They accompanied them to the polls. Women have been involved in politics for generations. Now, in terms of women who have run for the president, I want to just tell you about 3 specific women, again, to underscore why Clinton was such a big deal. The first woman to run on a major party ticket for president is a woman named Margaret Chase Smith. Margaret Chase Smith was a senator from the state of Maine who had taken over for political office when her husband, who was a congressman at the time, died in office. And she took over for him as sort of her wifely responsibilities. She was a congresswoman and then a senator from the state of Maine. She served as a moderate Republican in the Senate. And it's important to say that she's a moderate Republican in the Senate in the 1940s and the 1950s, because these are decades when the Republican Party is pretty divided. On the one hand, we have Joseph McCarthy, who was taking the party in a really strong anti-communist direction, and Margaret Chase Smith sort of represents the opposite wing of the party. She's a moderate Republican, and this matters because in 1964, Chase Smith decides to run as a female Republican for the Republican nomination for president. Now, she runs as a moderate Republican who's critical of Joseph McCarthy. She loses that nomination, and she loses to Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater, who's nominated as the Republican candidate for president, of course, loses the presidential election, but he, arguably more than lots of other Republicans that come after him, are responsible for taking the Republican Party in such a strong anti-communist direction. Now, this happens in 1964. In the next presidential election, Chase Smith is followed by another woman who ran for president. But this woman didn't run on one of the major 2-party tickets. She actually ran on the Communist Party ticket. This woman is named Charlene Mitchell, and she ran for president as a communist with a man named Mike Zagarel as her running mate, who actually was too young to constitutionally even serve as president. Still, the Communist Party female candidate's name appeared on the ballot in a few states. They held a national convention. They ran as Marxist communists, and they had a pretty strong radical following that was deeply critical of the Vietnam War, that was deeply critical of American foreign policy, that was supportive of the anti-war movement. Of course, they did not win. They did not appear on the ballot in most states, but it did set the stage for another famous communist, black female communist, named Angela Davis, whose name might sound more familiar, both because of her activism in the 1960s and 70s, her murder trial, and the fact that she spoke at the Women's March in January. Angela Davis ran for president in 1980 and 1984, also as a communist. Okay, now, by far, I'm going to go quickly, the most notable female predecessor to Clinton was another black woman named Shirley Chisholm, who ran for president in 1972 as a Democratic Party candidate. She also did not get the nomination, but Chisholm's story is important for a couple of reasons. First of all, Chisholm was elected as a black female Democrat in 1968. She was this famous representative from Brooklyn, New York. She helped form the Congressional Black Caucus, the National Women's Political Caucus in Congress, and she decided in 1970 that she was going to run as a Democrat for president. When she ran, she was famous for saying that she felt that the bigger obstacle in her success was her gender, not her race. And so there was a lot of political turmoil over what it would mean, whether she has to ask her husband's permission to seek this office. Now, Chisholm's important for us in 2017 because Clinton liked to refer to her on the campaign trail, but also Obama in the 2008 election said Chisholm helped lay the groundwork for his own candidacy as a black man running for office. And Clinton could say that she was also following in her footsteps. So again, if we're to understand the significance of Clinton, one is to see just how few women came before her, and also why there's such a generational divide in her supporters, right? These older female voters, they could appreciate just how significant it was that Clinton got the nomination.
Great, thank you very much. So building from there, since you brought Obama up, so I'm going to bring men into this conversation too, because I think in order to talk about gender, we need to talk about men and masculinity as well as women and femininity. In this past election, Donald Trump's single largest constituency of voters was white men, and particularly white men without a college degree. And I don't think this is a complete accident insofar as Trump frequently raised issues relating to gender throughout his campaign. And you all were there, I'm sure you remember many of them. He famously labeled Hillary Clinton in the midst of a debate a nasty woman, and accused her of playing the woman card in seeking votes. His past history of bragging about sexually harassing and perhaps even sexually assaulting women did not seem to hurt him with his core voters, who were willing to shrug it off as what was called locker room talk at the time of the campaign. In December 2016, after he had won the election, when Time magazine named Trump their person of the year, he thanked them for the honor, but he said he would have much preferred to have been named man of the year. That would have been a higher honor to him. And all of this has led a number of commentators to suggest that Donald Trump's electoral success is speaking to a crisis of masculinity in America, and perhaps particularly a crisis of masculinity among white men in America. So, for example, an editorial in the New York Times from about 2 weeks ago read, quote, "President Trump ran a campaign of aggrieved masculinity, appealing to men who felt the rightful place in society has been taken from them by a stream of immigrants stealing their jobs, women who don't need husbands to support them, and members of minority groups who don't work as hard but get special treatment." So all of this masculinity talk and man talk leaves me with a number of questions. I'm going to turn to Dr. Austin first and ask if all this man talk is unprecedented in general in American political culture, and then also to ask you why it is that Trump's appeal to restoring traditional masculine roles and power played less well to men of color as the voting electorate as opposed to white men in this last election.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah. All right. So I think, I was thinking about this. I was trying to think of examples, and there are so many. And I think, partly I wanted to start with the question about why is the appeal to a traditional masculinity attractive? Why was it seemingly more attractive? I'm not sure it was more. I think it's when is it not attractive? I think when is it not appealing? And so the two examples I wanted to bring out, one is Teddy Roosevelt at the turn of our last century, the 20th century. He is taking office at a particular time when the sort of political economy is changing and the kinds of work that white men in particular are doing is also shifting, so that there are more sort of the kinds of jobs that we think about as kind of commonplace now, which are sort of middle management, office jobs, and so more and more white men are doing those kinds of jobs, and there seemingly is a crisis of masculinity, of white masculinity at that moment as well. And so Teddy Roosevelt sort of crafts this sort of cerebral but also kind of physical white masculinity, and finds a way to sort of infuse it with with the sort of Jack Johnson, who's a African-American boxer at the time, masculinity. And sexual aggression is absolutely part of the kind of masculinity that Teddy Roosevelt crafts. So it's not all that unusual, sort of rhetorically or actually what we're seeing. The second example I wanted to bring up is actually the election of 1800, where Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, who's like one of our favorites right now, I think, are sort of going at it. And I wanted to, there's a great book by Joanne Freeman, who, the name of which I can't remember, something about honor. But essentially what she's looking at is sort of the role of gossip around a particular kind of manhood virtues at the time. So the sort of thinking about who's the right kind of man, what are the right kind of manhood qualities we want for our leader is not new. I think it's mobilized in a particular way, and maybe the sort of vulgarity around the way it's mobilized is slightly different. I don't know. I'm not sure I can comment on that, and I'm not sure that that's true. But I think, you know, in 1800, the sort of questions that folks, both elites and non-elites, were asking about some of the sort of professional but also moral improprieties of either Jefferson or Hamilton are not that different than the questions that we ask ourselves now about our candidates. And are not read all that differently than the way we read them now. Like, we either read them as, you know, we're aghast, or secretly, right, this is a kind of strength and power that we want, right? So I think, you know, we have this mixed way. I think the last thing I want to say about this is that I think it's especially, and this is sort of in response to the second part of the question, I think it's hard to parse masculinity from the ways in which it's infused with racial and class components. So, like, thinking about the election of 1800, the definitions of manhood at that moment are absolutely raced and classed. Because the institution of racialized slavery is 100 years old at that point, and so it's impossible to not be thinking of a manhood that is the particular kind of raced and classed manhood. So I think it's not possible to kind of, I don't know, pull those three things apart from each other, because the definitions for all three of them are so infused with each other that it's nearly impossible to try to think about a masculinity that is not already a raced masculinity, or a masculinity that's not already a specific kind of classed masculinity. And the way that they've been sort of normalized, our definitions of them have been normalized to appear as if they don't have these other components in them. So I think it's difficult to do that. I think the thing I'm sort of interested in is the second demographic of who voted for Trump. And so, because I'm sort of not surprised at the appeal to white men, but I am surprised at the appeal to college-educated white women. Yep. And I feel like that's a kind of, that's super interesting to me. I'm sort of interested in seeing like all of the stuff that social scientists are going to say about that.
Great, thank you very much. So maybe still building on the same general question, thinking about different demographics that were either attracted to Donald Trump as a candidate or turned away because, maybe particularly because of the way he played gender as part of his campaign. As part of exit polls suggest, Trump only won about 14%, I think, of the LGBT vote in the United States. So again, a very small percentage as well. And so I'm going to ask Dr. Kluchin, if it's okay, whether you think recent attention to or legislation regarding LGBT issues in the United States helps explain or understand that particular statistic.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you hear me? I feel like I have to ask that even though I know I have a super loud voice, which I will use. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, looking at this election personally made me think to the 1970s quite a bit, where you have the rise of the gay and lesbian movement, which I should point out had actually started in the 1950s. It's not like Stonewall suddenly comes out of nowhere in 1969. But there's a huge political backlash in the 1970s, and I think that's not really a surprise. Because in the 1970s we have the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, erases for the first time homosexuality, gets out of that. The Civil Service Commission in 1975 ends a ban. There had been a federal ban that said the federal government will not employ gays and lesbians. That gets pushed away. You have, by 1980, literally thousands of gay and lesbian groups on campuses and cities in, there's the gay gay Democrats, the gay Republicans. I mean, you have a political movement. And it's not surprising then that in the 1970s, starting in the election of 1976, you have within the Republican Party and evangelical voters a push back against that. And in fact, much of the conservative movement in the 1970s is coming against that. And we see it actually at the local level. In 1977, the Miami-Dade County passes a gay rights ordinance, and it essentially recognizes the rights of gays and lesbians. And this is not unlike what we saw in Charlotte a year ago. This is what preceded the bathroom, the trans bathroom law. And there was a very, very D-level celebrity named Anita Bryant. She was the poster child for Minute Maid orange juice, so like very D-level, but she was, when you picked out your little flyer every day at the grocery store, that was her face, and she was deeply homophobic. And she instigates a campaign to get rid of and to overturn via proposition an ordinance that would have supported gay rights in Miami-Dade County. She goes so far as to call gays and lesbians human garbage. And she is successful. And she does this in part by allying with religious groups. So she allies with some very conservative evangelical Christians, some in the Catholic Church, conservative rabbis, and they overturn this law. So a law that had meant to give people rights is now overturned. And then we start to see this in 3 or 4 other cities pushing forward, and other cities are passing this. Eugene, Oregon, which you wouldn't expect. St. Paul, Minnesota, a very liberal place, is passing this. And one of the things actually where it stops is in California, because the next year there's a Los Angeles, someone part of the Los Angeles School District, and he wants to pass a proposition across the state that would ban the employment of anyone who is gay or lesbian and any ally. Now, the unions are against this, and really, I guess, fairly surprisingly, if we look at political parties now, but not in the early or late 70s, Ronald Reagan, who was governor, is deeply opposed to this, and he's one of the people that helps end this. He says this violates free speech, this is not okay. But part of what happens and what this is laying the groundwork for is that you have this rise in gay rights. So for recent times, we're looking at the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell in 2010. We're looking at the legalization of gay marriage by the Supreme Court in 2013. And it's not surprising to me then as a historian to look at the election of 2016 and to see every Republican candidate stand up and say, I oppose gay marriage. Several came out against or in favor of the trans bathroom law. So saying the trans law said you have to use a public bathroom that corresponds with the sex on your birth certificate. So in many ways, I see this as Trump and other candidates, this is how they play to their base. They needed to say, we see who you are, we identify with your values, and part of that is by saying we are anti-gay rights. I think for Trump in particular, it makes sense, although I find it very difficult to wrap my head around, but it makes sense. This is a guy who couldn't really claim that he embodied Christian values. He'd been married 3 times, he talked about sexually assaulting women openly. He didn't, the base kind of looked at him and went like, we don't know what to do with you. But here, this is how he got his bona fides. I am anti-gay, I am anti-trans. He comes into his office and he gets rid of, protections for LGBT contractors. He reverses the Obama administration that had taken a stand against the trans bathroom laws. Gay rights, every time you see these victories, you see a political backlash. And that's really been happening since the 1930s. And so I think it's very much part of this larger pattern. But the question would be, why is this the political ping pong ball that we're talking about? We're talking about people's rights. Why is this such an issue?
Great, thank you. Before I pose my next question, I see some heads just barely peeking through the door there. If you'd like to come to this middle door, there's room to come sit on the floor and sneak in this way. So if you're trying to... More people?
No, they're all.
Oh, there are people there. Oh, that's open. I just feel badly for you people who are out in the hallway. I don't know if you can... Well, I'll leave you guys to muddle through. Okay. So we talked about, you talked about backlash in terms of LGBT issues and politics. I guess I want to talk about a different kind of backlash, or certainly response in my next question, which is that after Donald Trump was elected, and particularly the day after Donald Trump's inauguration, we saw, and perhaps some of you even participated in, an event that was billed as the Women's March. And according to many commentators and analysts, this was estimated to be the largest single-day protest in American history. So So I guess I'd like a little historical context to understand that kind of women's activism. Of course, there were men participating as well, but it was billed as the Women's March. So Dr. Slutsky, is there any precedent for this kind of women's activism around a presidential election or inauguration?
Yes. Okay, so I'm going to just give two brief examples. And these are the examples that the organizers of the Women's March consciously referred to, both as they're planning it, as they're publicizing it beforehand. And if you look at people that were interviewed at the protests, at marches in Washington, in Sacramento, all around the country, these are sort of the historical precedents that they're drawing from. So the one that most people talk about is this famous suffrage parade that happens in March of 1913, or this is also known as like the suffrage procession, as in like a more elegant word for a parade, which I'll get to. This march was held not the day after, but in fact the day before Woodrow Wilson was about to be inaugurated president. So Woodrow Wilson was elected president in this 1912 election, which is a super interesting election because it was a four-way race in which, this is when Teddy Roosevelt runs as a progressive, Eugene Debs runs as a socialist, and Taft runs as a Republican. Now all three of these other candidates were either absolutely supporting a national women's amendment or at least sort of tacitly talking about it. And the candidate that wins the election, though he does win by a minority of voters, is an anti-suffragist. So all of this is to say that women were determined in 1912, 1913 to do whatever they could to put suffrage on the national stage. And so they planned this march the day before Wilson's election to try to both steal his thunder and to demonstrate to the public that they were not allowed to vote for this man for president and that their voice was not allowed to be represented, that his presidency, in other words, does not reflect the will of all the people. That's a really radical critique. You know, like if you think about what they're taking on American institutions right here. Now, the other reason that the march is important is because the suffrage movement by this point is decades and decades old, right? It starts in 1848 or 1860s in earnest, and it's gone through lots of different phases and it's been divided. Now, it matters in 1913 because they said this is going to be a coalition of suffragists, of racist suffragists. This is a segregated march. And it's also going to be, it's going to represent all of our interests. And they knew that it had to be that way because they were going to get verbally attacked and they were going to get politically attacked, and they were. So as they parade down Pennsylvania Avenue, you see these women riding horses, you see floats, you see bands. There's 8,000 marchers that are trying to draw attention in the most dramatic way possible that a president is about to be inaugurated that they do not support. Now, the other historical precedent that gets brought up by the marchers this January is a march that happened on the 50th anniversary of when suffrage was actually added, when we get the 19th Amendment, which is on August 20th. And so the 50th anniversary was August 20th in 1970. And there's this famous march called the Women's Strike for Peace and Equality. And it was quite literally a day in which women in 1970 said, we are going to go on strike. We are going to go on strike from all realms of our lives. And so you see, I like to think that you saw the most creative signs in the January March. I like to think that they looked at the signs of the marchers in 1970. My favorite one is, don't iron while the strike's hot, to try to demonstrate, because this is people talk a lot about intersectional feminism now. This is the beginnings of that, when these women, for example, are saying, we want to bring a revolution. We want to talk about inequality in both our public lives, so we should go on strike from work, but we should also, don't iron, go on strike from our private lives to draw attention to these inequalities in our daily private family lives. So 50,000 marchers participate in this 1970 march in New York City. You see tens of thousands of women participate in strikes and in marches all around the country. So I suppose that women in January 2017 are drawing on this longer tradition of trying to draw attention to what they see as their lack of representation in all realms of life, public and private. And it's sort of intersectional before the word was in existence. Okay, sorry, I'm taking more time than I need.
That's okay, great, thank you. So you brought up issues, and I want to kind of stick with the Women's March for a moment here, thinking about who was included, who was excluded in the past as well. There was some controversy, and this didn't always hit the media, it did a little bit, but there was some controversy in the planning stages of this Women's March in Washington and the marches around the country regarding who was running the event and who was going to participate, who felt like they were included. And in particular, many women of color worried openly in social media in particular, but also in the press, asking, is this going to be yet another white women's protest in the United States, or is this really something that speaks to us as well? So I'm going to ask Dr. Austin to maybe talk about whether you think the history of feminism, but also women's organizing in particular since World War II in America, can help explain the context for these concerns. Where were they coming from in 2016, 2017?
Okay. I think yes. I would say yes. So I think this idea of coalition building and a common agenda is a difficult one. And I think, right now the way that it's being, that some of it's being kind of critiqued is around identity politics. And so I think looking back at the formation of kind of the early feminist movement and some of the critiques from African American women in particular, many of whom were former Black Panthers, about the kinds of issues that sort of the feminists of the late 20th century were identifying as being central to a kind of women's liberation movement and not kind of matching up with issues that women of color, third world women, Black women were facing that were specifically around class and race. I mean, I think again, right, this is the attempt to sort of parse the relationships between these three things is a super difficult one. And the concept of building coalitions around something that might be a sort of common agenda or common issues to fight around really needs to include understanding the ways in which these identities sort of interact, the ways in which I think we have to figure out how to pay attention to differences in organizing that are not afraid of the differences. I think oftentimes we talk about trying to figure out how to, that if we pay attention to them, that somehow we're paying attention to inferiority, or we're paying attention to, or we're bringing attention to differences that are already valued differently. And I think if we can really accept that they are indeed valued differently, like we come into them with the hierarchies already kind of essentialized in those differences. And if we could really identify that and really then talk about how we can sort of dismantle that value system in order to organize around things that really do kind of impact. There's sort of like slow deaths for everyone, but like some people are dying faster than others. So like figuring out really sort of how we could value our differences and understand that that the hierarchies are already essentialized within them. And I think that was I think that was the argument that sort of early black feminists were attempting to make, right? That we needed to, that we were all being impacted by these systems of oppression and the ways in which they interact. And some people less so than others, but essentially all sort of marginalized and minoritized people were being impacted by them. And so trying to figure out the bigger impact and then how we could organize around particular things that yes, we're having kind of different degrees of impact, but essentially they would not benefit very many of us for a long time.
Thank you. I'm sorry to pull the microphone out from
so
under you.
it's fine.
I'm watching the clock
Yeah.
here, and I think I'm going to jump to the last question, if that's okay. So I brought one more question in with me. We said we'd talk about reproductive rights here today, too, and I'm going to raise that question, and then after that, we're going to open it up to the audience. So one of the many, many issues that Donald Trump ran on in 2016 was the promise to restrict women's reproductive rights in the United States. And since coming to office, President Trump has acted on this promise in a variety of ways. So just to catch you up, if you haven't been reading the news lately, just after the inauguration, President Trump signed an executive order that some call the Global Gag Rule. The order prohibits U.S. funding of international organizations that offer advice on family planning if they include abortion as an option that they lay out before their clients. He has appointed the staunchly anti-choice former Georgia Congressman Tom Price as the Secretary of Health and Human Services. And Price, if you do not know, has sponsored bills that call for giving full personhood rights to fertilized eggs, which would effectively end all emergency contraception and abortion in America. He is also opposed to any kind of government mandate for the provision of free birth control. And then finally, the now defunct repeal and replace legislation that the Trump administration was pushing last month to replace Obamacare called for defunding Planned Parenthood as well. So this leads me to ask Dr. Kluchin, who's our specialist on this topic, have women's reproductive rights always been so controversial in the United States? And if not, what historical events or movements have really launched this as such a major issue in American politics? In 5 minutes flat.
5 minutes flat. Oh. Well, I can just say yes and be done, but I'll provide some historical analysis. I want to begin, and I might hit 6 minutes, I'm sorry, by distinguishing between the terms reproductive rights and reproductive justice. And I think those are really important to distinguish. Reproductive rights tends to equal abortion, right? If you hear that term, reproductive rights, you think the right to abortion. That's a very narrow reproductive right. And that also, I think this ties very nicely to what Paula was just saying. The right to abortion came out of the feminist movement in the 1960s and the 1970s, and it was largely white feminists who placed it at the center. Now that doesn't mean that feminists of color weren't advocating for abortion rights. They were, because they were dying in the underground at much higher rates than white women. But women of color and a minority of white women joined what was called the reproductive justice movement. And reproductive justice is far longer. It's about the right to access contraception. It's about the right to access abortion. It's about ending sterilization abuse, which has been happening. But it was even beyond that. It talked about having the ability to bear a child when and under what conditions a woman wanted, but then also to be able to raise that child. And raise that child in dignity. So every woman who becomes a mother should be able to send her child to public schools, and good public schools. She should be able to have adequate housing, not just adequate, but good housing. That means no lead paint, no toxins in the water. And most recently, and the reproductive justice movement is alive and kicking, it is very strong. Most recently, it's teamed up with Black Lives Matter to say that a right of motherhood is to be able to have your son leave the house and know that he's coming back home, right? He won't be a victim of police brutality. This puts issues of reproductive justice at in an intersectional framework, but it also forces people to say that different reproductive rights are available to different people. White women could make abortion their issue because they had better access to contraception. When they went into a Planned Parenthood, they could say, I want the pill, I want a diaphragm. If a black woman was walking into Planned Parenthood in 1970, more than likely a doctor would say, I'm going to give you an IUD because you can't take it out and I don't trust you with it. So reproductive services, reproductive health has been available differently depending on race and class. But part of what reproductive justice does is it places it in these larger contexts of social movements.
Yes.
So the Black Panthers, you look at the Young Lords, you look at other larger radical groups, it doesn't try to separate sex from race and class. And I know I've used up almost all of my time, but I want to bring that out because I think when we use the reproductive rights model, it assumes a white middle class feminism, and that's not everyone's reality. So I think I've used my time. I'll stop and not tell you the other part. But I think it's important to use that term in that way.
Great, thank you very much. We have about 15 minutes left here today, so we are anxious to open the floor up to questions that you might have brought with you or developed over the course of our discussion here. If I call on you, if you could please just stand up and voice your question loudly so we could all hear it, I would appreciate it. Yes.
Good afternoon, Dr. Siegel. Thank you again. Enjoy all your panel discussions you provided here today. My question centers question about the women's movement march that took place. Where do you see the movement in terms of the anti-war and militarism that we're seeing? I'm a big fan of Medea Benjamin, Co-Pink, and I think that some of the messaging has gotten lost because for such a big march, for such an international movement, we aren't seeing the mothers and the women saying that they aren't going to send their boys to war. You know, and why is that sort of thing? And then second question, just real quick. Honored Oprah Winfrey is doing a movie of Henrietta Lacks. Can you share your thoughts about her?
Why don't we start with the first question maybe, looking at women's activism around anti-war movements in particular and in the current moment?
Yeah, I think, that's you. Okay, that's me. Okay, I'll be real fast because no, you're absolutely right, and I was struck by the ways, so he brought up Code Pink, and for those of you, I think like Code Pink happened in a generation when you were all children and maybe not paying attention to it. This is the second war in Iraq. This is Bush's war on terror, and what happens is that there's a strong anti-war movement following the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan after 9/11, and you see a generation of women leading an anti-war movement, and there's this Code Pink movement where you see women appearing in Congress, holding protests all around the country, and it's not that it goes away, it stays. They certainly are vocal in turning the House in the 2006 election towards the Democrats. They're vocal in the election of Obama, and they, as far as I know, they're not organized as a voice like within the Women's March, right? So if you look at, I'm imagining all of the women who put out statements as feminists in the march, and so they, you know, there's very much like a policy that's critical of American foreign policy, American interventionist foreign policy, but organizing as mothers that are opposed to war, I just don't think I saw that, unless I'm wrong. Okay, you want to get the next part about Henrietta Lacks? Anyone?
It was just kind of what do we think about Gila and this?
You're going to probably have to tell the audience
I
who
know.
Henrietta Lacks is.
Henrietta Lacks was a woman who died of cervical cancer in the 1940s. She lived outside of Baltimore in rural Maryland, and she goes to seek help, seek treatment at Johns Hopkins University Hospital, which is one of the top hospitals in the nation, still the top med school in the nation, but it had a public program. And part of the public program meant you would receive health care for free, but you would be part of human subject experimentation. And what happens for her is that when she has her tumor removed, portions of it are kept and then they are cultured in the lab, and it turns out to be the first immortal cell line, meaning that it reproduces itself. And her cells, which were taken without her knowledge, without her permission, have been sold for, at this point, billions and billions of dollars. They have been used in efforts to try to cure cancer, HIV, but they've been sold by Hopkins to institutions around the world. And her family didn't know about this. And so The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks is a book written by a journalist who explores the story and tells the family, and Oprah has now, she optioned it, and now she's about to produce a movie. So I think more power to her. I think, as a historian, I think it's It's another way to bring out issues of history of medicine, but it also says, you know, you're talking about Jim Crow America, so it brings out issues of race and racism, who has access to who doesn't. It's one more way, and I haven't seen the film yet, but my impression of it is it seems to be fairly historically accurate, so that's even better. But one of the cool things about the book is it's taught all over the country, and in a lot of we have the One World in One Book. I don't think we can afford the journalists. I think she charges like $20,000 to come and give a talk. But it's been at universities all over the country, so I think it's sparking those conversations, and that's deeply important.
Other questions? Yes, go ahead.
So, my question is actually about Planned Parenthood and then the defunding of it. I myself, having taken Professor Kluchin's class, find it very interesting that given such a racially charged environment, that the factor that defunding Planned Parenthood doesn't necessarily say that abortion's wrong, it's just abortion's wrong if you can't pay for it yourself. So do you guys find it interesting that that's not in the dialogue at all of the movement, and you know what we can do to actually change that?
Yes, I won't dominate. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a surprise because in 1977 we have the Hyde Amendment passed, and the Hyde Amendment was, and it still is, it's re-upped every year. It prohibits the federal funding of abortions. So there's this brief period between when Roe legalizes abortion in the first 2 trimesters in 73 and 77, where women who received public assistance could get their abortions covered under public assistance. California still does that. Medi-Cal will cover abortions. But the Hyde Amendment says federal funds can't be used unless there are instances of rape, incest, or maternal life is threatened, not health. So in many ways what happens with the Hyde Amendment is that pro-life legislators struck out trying to create a human life amendment, which essentially would have been an amendment to the Constitution that declared as the moment of conception, there's human life at the moment of conception, and at that moment, that fertilized egg has the full rights of a person under the 14th Amendment. The idea would be then that would knock Roe over and it would be in the Constitution, you can't get it out. Well, that fails 4 times in a row. So the Hyde Amendment is the next best thing for those politicians. The problem, though, is who has access to contraception, and it makes this privilege, and again, this is that reproductive justice framework. It makes then access to contraception and abortion in this instance, the privilege of those who can afford it, right? So I think we've seen this all at the same time. And I would raise it in many ways, it's the issue of gay rights. Why do we have these 2 political frisbees, ping pongs, whatever you want to call them, issues of women's reproductive rights, issues of gay rights, become these issues where both sides draw down to their base, right? They get kind of thrown around. But yeah, there's been very little talk about race and racism in medicine, and that's part of what the Gila story can tell. You know, there's that much longer story that comes out. You have Tuskegee syphilis study, you've got sterilization abuse. We have these long stories, they're just not in the public eye.
Other questions? Yes, go ahead.
So I have a question regarding a pretty, I think, explosive topic that we may have seen on posters, the idea of abortion and Black genocide has, I think, become an incredibly powerful political argument that gets used to prevent reproductive justice issues from becoming more easily discussed. And I was wondering if anyone on the panel would like to discuss maybe some of the history regarding the idea of Black babies being explicitly targeted by Planned Parenthood, by Sanger, by this larger organization that then gives fuel for current day politicians to say, well, this organization is evil, let's get rid of it. It's a burden on us.
Okay. Someone asked a non-abortion question.
Before Dr. Kluchin answers, let me just say that whatever she says to you, you should also go read her book, because that's what it's all about, and she does a fabulous job. So.
There were a lot of concerns in the 60s and 70s that largely came from the Black Power movement, that Black women in particular, but you could also say this about brown women, were going to healthcare providers, and they were being told to use long-term contraception. They weren't being given the pill. With the pill, you stop taking it that's no big deal. But the IUD was out there too. And there's this real concern that black women were being targeted for, to have their reproduction limited exactly at the same moment that the civil rights movement had crested, that black power was on its way out. As soon as we're getting big, the Panthers said, the threat is that you're going to literally cut us down by cutting down our population. And there was an argument that this is black genocide. Now what's notable is a lot of women in the Black Panther movement said, hey, please stop. While we believe that we want abortion legalized, we would like an end to sterilization abuse, but we would like access to contraception on our own terms, please. So rather than saying we shouldn't have it and that we should be bearing children for the movement, we would like access to contraception, and then we are abortion legalized, sterilization abuse ended. And actually, to their credit, the Black Panthers changed their platform. The Young Lords, which is a Puerto Rican independence group, they come up with a 14-point platform in 1970, and it has reproductive justice as one of the planks. So you hear those cries. Recently what's happened, and this happened in Atlanta, was that several people in the pro-life movement were trying to gain political traction. So they started to hang these big posters arguing, and they like billboards, huge billboards, within black communities saying abortion is genocide. And the race issue is really dynamic here because it's white, pro-life, suburban groups hold on this historical issue in order to try to get black women to view, to become anti-choice, anti-abortion. So it's in many ways kind of an exploitation of that. I don't think, from my understanding, it was particularly effective, but I think it's really notable to have one population draw on issues of black genocide. But I think the other thing that I would add just very quickly is it takes away the agency of black women in there, right? It assumes that, first of all, they can be convinced by a billboard, but two, it misses that larger history where they said, hey, we want an end to sterilization abuse, we want abortion legalized, but we want the choice in contraception. And they have made these really great posters they were demonstrating, and they would say, what plans do you have to take care of my children? Because I plan to be out on that picket line. So unless you men plan to be babysitters, I'll see you later, give me my pill. And the men change their views. But it's history being manipulated in many ways.
I think we probably have time for one more question, if anyone has any they'd like to pose. Okay, so I'm gonna take an opportunity to ask my question for all of you, and it's really for all three of you. I don't care what order you go in, but it's a question that my students bring to me, which just has to do with the term feminism. And I have a lot of students, probably your same generation, both men and women alike, who have a gut reaction against the word feminism. It evokes something negative for them. And I guess I just want to ask all three of you if you think the word feminism still has utility today, or if female activists need something else to rally around.
Well, I'll say really quickly, language changes. And so I think, sure, it has utility. I think that, many folks have been talking about intersectional feminism, and I think when you have to put a modifier on something, it's problematic, which means there's something wrong with what the word itself means. So I think, thinking about how we can practice, because I think maybe what we need are verbs, and how we can practice a kind of sensibility and action, individual and collective action that embodies a feminism that I think, in the kind of earliest iterations of it, that was one that looked at kind of structural forms of oppression and the ways in which they were interacting. And so thinking about how are we embodying the kind of justice actions that would manifest themselves as being feministing.
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 Yes. That's a website.
It was coined here today.
No, it belongs to someone already. I'm sorry. It's not me.
I would add that oftentimes feminism gets these very narrow boundaries, and one of the other groups that felt very left out of the Women's March was pro-life women. And there were many pro-life women who called themselves feminists, and they felt that they had no place there. That in order to march, they had to be strictly pro-choice. And many of them talked about, especially on social media, that was very exclusionary. My response would be there are lots of inequalities that women face. There's no reason, if that one doesn't work for you, find another one to partner on. But it has been used kind of like that qualifier there are these broader definitions of what, and ideas in contemporary society about what it means to be a feminist, who is a feminist, and I think if it's going to be a useful term, it has to let go of those restrictions. It can be, anyone gets to define his or her feminism. Or as a group of my students, when I taught women's history, when we talk about feminism, one of the things that they used was Amy Poehler apparently has this line, great for you, not for me. And that was their definition of feminism. Great for you, not for me, let's find somewhere else that we can work together. And I kind of like the way that they phrase that, because it's accepting that there's no one single model of what it means to be a feminist, but feminists can have very similar goals in terms of advancing issues of women's equality.
And I know we're out of time, but I just want to add this anecdote that whenever I teach, obviously when I teach women's history, it's a very self-selected group, but whenever I teach like a survey class, I'm always curious to know, and I've been teaching for about 15 years now, so when I started, I always ask my students, how many of you sort of associate negative connotations or positive connotations? The overwhelming majority of survey students, when I started teaching in the early 2000s, was negative connotations. This swung dramatically with the election of Obama and with like feminism becoming something in popular culture, like Amy Poehler and Taylor Swift and his whole generation of young women sort of trying to redefine what feminism is in this like third wave for a new generation. And it was interesting to see this, and I hate to say that it peaked like last year and the year before, but I think, I think it has peaked, and it's sort of this new conversation post Clinton's defeat and post the election of Trump, and it's going to be interesting to see. I look forward to continuing to ask my students, because you guys tell me way more than me saying to you, we should all be wearing the t-shirts that say this is what a feminist look like, because that's what feminism means to me.
Well, listen, let's thank our panelists one more time.